All right, we're going to continue our discussion of the Enlightenment by examining what effect these Enlightenment ideas had on the world around us. Ideas are not abstract, disconnected somethings that have no consequence for the world around it. Everything we do in the world is based on a philosophical assumption. And the more we can demonstrate the connection between ideas and the world around us, I think the more that encourages us to think rightly about the world around us. A couple of things I want the student to get out of this section. First, I want the student to understand, to identify the application of the Enlightenment ideas to cultural movements during this period. Secondly, I want the student to be able to identify the essential characteristics of the various artistic movements within the modern period. And thirdly, I want the student to be able to evaluate the idea of progress. Is progress a good way of thinking about either the modern period or our world today? Like I said before, the rise in the faith in the human, the more central man became in how we explain the world around us, the more it changed our institutions. When we believe that the world is primarily explained in reference to God, then we developed a system of government that was based on this conviction that it was a top-down sort of order. Our economics were based on this, our art was based on this. But now that we started to see a rise in human agency, the fact that humans can know the good and do the good, now the everyday average human became more important in the political process and the economic process, so on and so forth. And it led to a series of revolutions. A revolution is as a recognition that a system of government is no longer meeting the philosophical needs of a community. And throughout the latter half of the 18th century, there was a growing disconnect between these Enlightenment ideals as applied to social order. That we actually do have the ability to decide for ourselves whether or not this tax is good for us. So we need to be represented in the decisions about taxation. We do have an ability to be able to govern ourselves and to vote and things like this. And this disconnect between an older model of a divine right monarchy and the emerging democracies led to two, in particular, revolutions that threw off the old model of doing government and ushered in a new one. I guess I'm biased, but I think the best example is the American Revolution. Figures like Franklin and Jefferson were steeped heavily in Enlightenment thought. John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and all these great Enlightenment thinkers. They developed their own idea of the role that government should play in society. They developed their own idea of the role that a citizen should play in a society. And they departed from the medieval idea of monarchy. Franklin and Jefferson reflected Enlightenment values in that they saw that the average person, or at least the average rich white male, was competent enough to participate in his own governance. Jefferson and Franklin saw that the individual was capable of knowing the good. And in their mind, if you're capable of knowing the good, you are capable of doing the good. We discussed this a little bit with Plato and his idea that education Reformation was a product of knowing the good. Anyone who knows the good will by necessity do the good. But this was not absolute. Franklin and Jefferson also had a background in Calvinism, believe it or not. Even though they may not have been subscribers to Calvinism, they at least recognized the fact that there is evil in this world and that men's hearts are to whatever degree corrupt, and that there is a need for some sort of checks and balance on the populace. And this is why they restricted voting rights to the noblemen, to the people that had an education. Obviously, the peasants, the local farmer who was uneducated, they did not think that they were qualified to participate in their own governance. Obviously men, since men were the ones that were educated, obviously free men. And this is also why they built in the Electoral College. The Electoral College, its main function was to prevent democracy run amok. If the populace elected this unqualified figure purely because he was popular, then the Electoral College can step in and say, no, we're going to have this guy instead. So there was a fundamental belief in human agency, in the human condition, with this head nod to traditional Christian perception or formulation of the human condition as being sinful. And there was a fundamental distrust of power that was reflected in this as well. So that is how America chose to apply Enlightenment values to its political realm. A second revolution that sees this application is the French Revolution. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. This idea that we are all capable of participating in our own government. The one major difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution is the American head nod towards a traditional Calvinistic theology of original sin was not a part of the French Revolution. There was an ultimate and absolute confidence in the in the human condition. So they did not build in the same sort of safeguards on liberty. A Bill of Rights, that's an important one. Electoral College, things like that the Americans did. And this led to widespread pogroms when the people were not acting how they should, when they were not exemplifying the purity of the human condition. French society was not equipped to control that or limit that, so they had to come in with the guillotine and imprisoning people, and it got ugly, and it led to the collapse of this experiment, and eventually led to Napoleon and the return of this monarchical way of doing things. But the French Revolution is a pretty good illustration of how deeply not just a couple of people, uber nerd philosophers, felt about these values, but how deeply everyone felt about these values, or at least a majority, a significant number of people felt about these Enlightenment ideas, Enlightenment values. In addition to politics, another area that we see Enlightenment thought being applied to is economics. Another Scotsman, Adam Smith, wrote a book, The Wealth of Nations, that exemplified these Enlightenment thoughts. Smith's Wealth of Nations assumes that people will act according to their own interest, that people are reasonable, that people are able to be educated, yet at the same time, Smith, who was a Presbyterian, also held on to this idea that man is corrupted. Man may be reasonable, but man is corrupted. And his system pits one person's greed against another person's greed, the producer's greed versus the consumer's greed. And he described it as an invisible hand that mediates between these two poles of greed to find where the market values something. So if I am not willing to pay $5 a gallon for gasoline, I'm just not willing to do that. My role as a consumer is to pay as little as possible for this gallon of gasoline. And the producer, Exxon, their goal is to charge as much as they can for it. So the greed of the producer in trying to make as much money as they can is tempered with the greed of the consumer to hold on to as much money as they can. And Adam Smith theorizes that the price will fall somewhere in between there. And it will be a healthy compromise that neither side is fully happy with, but this is how it's going to work. This is an application of the Enlightenment idea of the reasonableness of a person's actions, that people act according to self-interest. It is also a reflection of the Christian value of original sin. So Adam Smith has a very illustrative combination there, again supporting this idea that the Enlightenment did not supplant religion, that the Enlightenment became another lens through which religion was articulated. Third area we're going to talk about is art. And this is, in some ways, a much more complex illustration of the Enlightenment because it reaches back into the Renaissance a little bit. The first artistic movement we're going to talk about is called Mannerism. And art historians place this in the 16th century, somewhere around 1510 to 1590. So this makes it a late Renaissance movement. And when we use the term Mannerism, it's used without a whole lot of precision. But most art historians, when they look at Renaissance art and when they look at late Renaissance art, they can see that there's a difference there. And some of the characteristics of Mannerism, some of the things that separate it from Renaissance art, is the fact that this art tends to be a little bit more artificial. It's less realistic. That doesn't mean they throw realism out the window, but they're not looking for realism in every element of the composition. You see a lot of strained poses. You see a lot of angst and motion and tension in the human figure here. You see a lot of emotional content. You see elongated human figures. Again, the Enlightenment kind of rises out of this idea of humanism. So the human, the person, takes a central role in Manneristic art. And they use a very different scale, color, and use of lighting that is unique to Mannerism. And probably the number one illustration of Mannerism would be Michelangelo. Michelangelo was probably the most famous artist from the Renaissance and fits in this movement of Mannerism. We're going to look at one of his paintings, The Fall of Man and the Expulsion from Paradise. And there's a couple of things I want the student to observe here that illustrates these Manneristic characteristics. Notice behind Adam and Eve and behind the serpent, there's not a whole lot of landscape. The focus is on the color and the focus is on the human being. So here again, an illustration of a little less realistic, a little bit more artificial. You see the use of lighting in the coils of the snake. You see the use of lighting on the individual muscles in the human figure. And it seems like there's a lot of muscles in these guys. It does not necessarily look anatomically accurate 100%, but muscles offered Michelangelo an opportunity to use shadow and use light and use color. Notice Adam and Eve as they're being expelled from the garden. Look at the expression on their faces and how strained they are, and the emotion that's there, the tension, the angst that's on their faces. These are all great illustrations of Manneristic art. Another artist that we can take a look at is a guy named Tintoretto. And Tintoretto was known for producing works massive in scope and size and also emotion. We'll look at his crucifixion. And notice that this portrayal of the crucifixion differs significantly from the Byzantine mode, differs significantly from Giotto. And notice how he uses light. He uses light behind Christ on the cross in the center to bring all attention to the center. Notice how most of the figures have surrounded Christ and they've all directed their attention to what Christ is doing on the cross. We see the two thieves in different stages of the crucifixion, but yet the focus is still on Christ. It's almost a distraction to look at these figures, to look at the soldiers skulking in the corner, tossing dice for casting lots for Christ's clothes. The use of light and color brings our attention towards the center of this painting. Again, when we talk about the Enlightenment, the term light is used intentionally and purposefully in that label because it was an era that was focused on the use of light, artistically, philosophically, religiously, so on and so forth. The second artistic movement during the Enlightenment was the Baroque movement, and art historians put this around the end of the 16th century through the middle of the 18th century, so 1590 to 1750. And this was, in particular, a Catholic movement, not exclusively, but primarily a Catholic movement that tried to argue against the iconoclasm of the Protestant Reformation. Let's think back to Luther, and he tried to identify the basic biblical convictions that a Christian needs to have. And he said all these other things that the Roman Catholic Church added to the Christian faith, we have to strip all of those away. Whether that's a belief in saints, a belief in indulgences, or if it's the use of art in the worship service. So the Protestants, very much like the Byzantines well before them, stripped the churches of all these artistic accretions, additions to the Christian faith, and preferred a very simple, very basic layout of their churches, and so on and so forth. And it continues to exert an influence on Protestant churches today. Walk into your average Protestant church, what works of art are there? Be hard pressed to find any art in a Protestant church. A lot of times we'll have a symbolic art, we'll have an empty cross at the front. A lot of churches nowadays are becoming comfortable with these shiny little banners that come down. It says Jesus is Lord and has maybe a lamb or a trumpet on it. But there's not really stained glass windows. You don't see sculptures being commissioned. You don't see paintings being displayed. In the American 21st century church, we are, to a certain extent, iconoclastic and fall in this category. And that's kind of a shame, because when you look at the Baroque artists, they had some amazing artists. They produced something that reflected God's beauty, and something I think even we as Protestants should at least be in a position to appreciate and admire, even if we don't incorporate it into our worship. Some of the characteristics of Baroque art was big, large-scale arts. These were anti-Protestant propaganda pieces. Most of them had biblical or allegorically biblical subjects to them. There was a sense of movement. You had a lot of upward angles. You had a lot of swirling spirals. You had very bold color, new light, new painting techniques that was able to emotionally engage the viewer. Rubens is one of the best examples of Baroque art, especially in his work Descent from the Cross. This portrays one of the central actions in the Catholic liturgy, Christ's sacrifice on the cross. It's not really an accident when you walk into a Catholic church and you see a cross with Christ crucified on it. You walk into a Protestant church and you see an empty cross. Both the Protestant and Catholic Church emphasize greatly the work of Christ on the cross and his death. And both emphasize to a high degree the value of the resurrection. But it reflects a time in our history that if the Catholic Church would have claimed the dog as their mascot, the Protestant Church would have claimed the cat as their mascot. It's not that arbitrary. Because when you look at the Catholic liturgy, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, is a central weekly part of that liturgy. So therefore it makes sense that the Catholic Church would emphasize the suffering and death of Christ. The Protestant church doesn't have that same emphasis. Protestant church usually celebrates communion once a month, some churches once every quarter, some churches once a year. So there's not that same emphasis on the death of Christ. We like to talk about the resurrection of Christ. Unfortunate ships passing in the middle of the night, because we fundamentally agree on the importance of these actions. But when you look at Rubens' painting, it fit very well with the Counter-Reformation Catholic agenda of emphasizing the death of Christ. A couple interesting notes. Notice Mary, Mother of God, standing next to Jesus on the left in blue. We see Mary Magdalene and Mary, half-sister of the Virgin Mary, kneeling. And most of the medieval portrayals of the Virgin Mary, Mary, Mother of God, have her kneeling. But something that humanism and the Protestant Reformation did, even for the Catholic Church, is renew this interest in texts and sources. And in the Bible, it says that Mary, Mother of God, stood next to Christ. So here we see Mary standing. So when we talked before about both Catholics and Protestants claim that the Roman Catholic Church needed to reform itself, this is an evidence of that. You know, even though the Protestants emphasize sola scriptura to a much higher degree than the Catholics, there was, even in the Catholic Church, this sense that we need to return to a biblical, textual faith. Notice the position of Christ's body. It's twisted, it's lifeless, it's gray. And the grayness of his body is highlighted by both the blood on his body and the redness of the robe of one of his followers. The twisting of his body, some art historians have compared to the Laocoon group in the classical period, this sense of pain and strain and angst that we see even in death, that Jesus was, his crucifixion just was an incredibly painful suffering on the cross. And the way that Rubens uses light highlights Christ as the centerpiece of where attention is drawn to in this work. Catholics were not the only ones that use this Baroque style of art. We do have a Protestant, a Calvinistic Protestant who engaged in this as well, a guy named Rembrandt. And we can see his Calvinism in his choice of subjects. We're going to take a brief look at the sacrifice of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. Rembrandt's Calvinism drew him to these types of scenes, of episodes, where the will of God was hard to swallow. But if you have faith in God, then you have faith in God's plan, and there's nothing to worry about. This idea that God is in control of absolutely everything is a hallmark of the Catholic faith, and drew Rembrandt to these episodes in the Bible where it was hard to swallow God's plan. Notice how Rembrandt portrays the scene in action. We see the angel gripping Abraham's hand, even though the text just says that the angel spoke to Abraham and he stopped. Notice that the knife is still falling from his hand, still pointed at Isaac, but still falling in the air, the sense of motion. The use of light highlights Isaac, highlights his the centrality and innocence of that sacrifice. Now also notice that God's plan is found elsewhere in this painting. Right behind this episode, we see a ram waiting for Abraham to notice him and sacrifice him in place of Isaac. That God has already provided a solution to this problem. Abraham didn't have to look around for the ram. So this is a great example of how Rembrandt used Baroque characteristics, used Baroque techniques in order to portray a Protestant message and not strictly a Catholic message. Although for my money, the best Baroque artist out there was not a painter at all, a guy named Bernini. And he was a sculptor, he was an architect. He helped design St. Peter's Basilica and a lot of the ornamentation in there and a lot of the statues that are found in Rome are Bernini statues, uniquely Baroque statues. And the one that captures my attention anytime I see it, and I cannot wait to see this thing in person. I cannot wait till I can stand there and just kind of absorb the real thing and not a two-dimensional screens version of it, is Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. This has become the standard by which all other Baroque art is measured. And it's a scene where St. Teresa, who wrote a series of books reflecting on her dreams and visions of God, that became the foundation for the Carmelite order of monks and nuns later on. Teresa talks very emotionally about her encounter with God. It is not a rational, intellectual recounting of what she believes about God, but it is an emotional record of her experience with God. And in this painting, in this sculpture, we see an angel sent from God holding an arrow that's pointed at St. Teresa's heart. And this is an arrow of divine love. And in this moment, Teresa is overcome with emotion, overcome with ecstasy, joy. She is being showered in the rays of light coming down from God himself. And we get a sense, even if it's just for this moment, she was overcome by the presence of God. And me personally, I go back to Isaiah 6, when Isaiah sees God face to face, and his first reaction is, "Woe to me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live amongst a people of unclean lips." And then there's this moment where an angel comes down from God and has not an arrow in his hand, but a burning coal. And it's not a part of the text, but I have to think that there's a moment there where Isaiah thinks to himself, "That's it, I'm a goner. This angel's coming to smite me. I don't belong in the presence of God." And instead of smiting Isaiah, he cleanses Isaiah. And there must have been this moment where Isaiah realized what was going on. And this isn't in the text, but I can't imagine not just being overcome with the realization that Isaiah is not an object of judgment, but is an object of love. What does that feel like? What does that look like? How do we access that in this world? The Ecstasy of St. Teresa here is an analogous experience where there's this angel coming down with an arrow, and even though it's not in the text, Teresa must have thought in the back of her head, "That's it, I'm a goner." Like when unclean people come into the presence of a holy God, it's over. I'm done. And instead of piercing her with judgment and smiting her, that she becomes the recipient and beneficiary of divine love. And this statue captures that split-second moment where she is just overcome with the love of God. When you see the folds in her garment, it looks like there's action and motion going on there. Again, art historians compare this to the Laocoon group and the sense of motion and emotion that it evokes. Now, even though this is a Catholic sculpture designed for Catholic purposes, I see no reason why Catholics and Protestants can't agree that this reflects the love of God for us as people. And it's just, like I said, I can't wait to see this thing in person. It's got to just be amazing. Now we're going to wrap up our discussion of the Enlightenment with discussing the idea of progress. If you were able to summarize the whole trajectory of the Enlightenment in one word, I think it would be progress. From the Renaissance, there was this sense that they were correcting the wrongs of the Dark Ages, that the Dark Ages have gotten off course, and they were now developing new ways of doing things that were better than the medieval period. There's a sense that scientific discovery is leading us to greater and more accurate knowledge. This was also the age of exploration, where we were discovering new lands, and especially the way that you see European powers developing a colonial attitude. of civilizing and Christianizing these new people groups, there's a sense that we have progressed farther than they have. We have made further strides. And I think that this trajectory that the Enlightenment put us on is a fairly popular way of thinking about the world around us in our own day. This idea of progress was both the byproduct of Enlightenment thought and one of the driving forces in Enlightenment thought. That's something that we're going to question. This is especially something that the postmodern era just magnified and highlighted, that, hey, is this really the right way to look at things in the world around us? Are we really better off than people in the 14th century? Hey, we have great medical advances today, but the same technology that has given us great medical advances has also given us great advances in how to kill people in record numbers. Is that progress? Freedom. Hey, we have freedom. They didn't necessarily have freedom back then, which isn't necessarily all that true. But has our freedom produced a better life today than it had, way back when? I think it's right, especially for the Christian, to question this notion of progress. Because if Christians buy in lock, stock, and barrel to the idea of progress, this is where the narrative that the Enlightenment replaced religion. This idea that way back in the caves, in order to make sense of the world around us, people had to invent the idea of God. But the more knowledge that we get, the more progress that we make, of course everyone now understands that God didn't make it rain. There's a hydrologic cycle there. Of course now we understand that God didn't make the earth shake, that there's tectonic plates. I think Christians especially have to be very careful in buying into this idea of progress. In truth, I think everyone should question it, but Christians especially. And that's something I want you to discuss as a result of this lecture. These ideas are great, and we see some great innovations resulting from the Enlightenment philosophy, but can we buy into the notion of progress? Appreciate your time.
Thank you.